The first 3 weeks of the eruption here in Hawaii, crazy things would happen in the middle of the night. A new fissure would open up and it would threaten a new neighborhood. Thousands of people were evacuated from their homes. I started the Hawaii Tracker Facebook group to help people understand what's going on and get their questions answered.
Hey, how's it going? We're live. This is Fissure 20.
We had hundreds of people all throughout the neighborhoods sending in videos, articles, and images. We spend a lot of time making sure the accurate information gets out.
This is live. There's still lava moving.
They weren't just sharing a story, they were helping their neighbor. If a family was being evacuated, my group would just jump in and help out. So it was huge. They were watching out for each other.
Hello everybody, thank you for coming. Thank you for the support from everybody.
As we go through this, we're growing closer together as a community. When tragedies like this strike, you really realize how much you need each other.
Aloha everyone, I'm geologist Philip Ong, here with Mr. Dane DuPont of HawaiiTracker.com, bringing you guys another Kilauea volcano update. Today, Thursday, November 11th, 2021. Dane's going to be manning our chats, so submit your questions to him. We'll discuss questions along the way, and let him know if you have any issues with our audio or video. And we will be talking today about Kilauea and a little bit about Maunaloa as well, after our mid-broadcast intermission. And starting off, you guys are seeing the infrared view taken from the USGS F1 camera that Dane has collected and looped here with the help of Bob Martin collecting some images too. So what you guys are seeing here is what happened earlier in the week. It was, I want to say, was it Tuesday or was it Monday? Maybe from Monday night into Tuesday. We saw this decrease in the output of lava from the west vent of Kilauea. You see it here, seen by the withdrawal of all those bright colors. And then it came back after a few hours, not quite a full day. It came back through and reflooded the area that had been crusted over, and maybe in a net lost some of the active area. But overall, it's pretty much back to where it was before, with following the same kind of patterns as far as filling lava in above and below that crust. Popping up ooze-up flows on the perimeter between a crater wall and the top of that lava lake. And it's flowing out a little bit onto that into that northernmost, lowest downdrop crater block that's on the edge of the crater that collapsed in 2018. So that's kind of what we have lined up today, is stepping through and looking at those patterns, comparing it a little bit to what happened back in a December 2020 eruption, and putting it in context of 2018 as well a little bit, right? So first off, just to state, this eruption is still within Hawaii Volcanoes National Park. It's not causing any threat to anyone. There is still fog, which is a nuisance and can be problematic for those that are sensitive. But overall, there's no lava going near anyone's house, and there's no prospect of anything like that going on. So it's really quite a bit different than 2018. So we'll point out how that's the case with some of the data that's come out so far, based on USGS releases here. So it's a great time to come and visit, actually. There's been lots of visitors to Hawaii Volcanoes National Park, and everyone that comes is seeing something a little bit different. Maybe a few people got to see the lava lake in a slightly more crusted over fashion, but then those shortly afterwards saw the big flood of lava that came back over and across, and now it's kind of back to before. The activity at the vents has been a little bit different. That's what you see here at the bottom right of this image right in here, highlighted right in there. That's that cone that's built up. You still see the bubbling, the red inside of there, kind of rising up with a surge of lava and then dropping down when it's receding as well. But always present within there that entire time, even though it's crusted over this other section and now tunnels its way out into the lake through that little pathway underground, something like that. So that's the pattern here at the west vent, and you can see there's a couple other things to notice, just to point out really quickly here. You can see once lava withdraws, you do see a little bit of this movement of this purplish crater floor. You know, you can still see that harder, not as fluid lava, not as bright colored on infrared, still moving a bit and moving these darker pieces that are these larger chunks of rock. And then at some point, some of them start re-emerging. You see them re-emerging all through here, and this is going to matter later on when we start looking at the laser level view of the depth of the lake here. So let's see if that's what we have coming up. But first, we'll look at the tilt. This happened here, between this. You see there is a surge here. Let's make my color the right highlight color. There was a surge that happened in the middle of the day on the 7th. That's when we saw that extra lava coming out and overtopping and pouring against the crater walls. So I pointed out in the time lapse a little bit later on. Followed by this big decrease right here. And I say big just compared to the recent changes, because in absolute magnitude, it was coming up from not quite 1.5 microradians to not quite minus 1 microradian, right? So that's maybe 2.5 microradians in total. We've had deflation inflation events that are bigger than that, right? This does not look like a typical deflation inflation event. It did have a inflation and then a deflation and then another inflation, but normally our deflation inflation events have more of a pattern where they come up and then they come back up at some different kind of angle, something like that, right? So it doesn't quite look right. It could be some similar process with just some different geometries. I don't exactly know, but that's the pattern that we actually observed was visible in the tilt here. This increase, short-term increase beforehand, and then this long-term draining right in the depth of this deflationary cycle right through here. And it seems like the gas measurement was measured, and it was measured at only 250 tons SO2 per day, which is very low. It's comparable to the non-eruptive times. But since then, it's popped back up as the tilt has come back up as well, and they've done measurements back on its backside. It's back to similar to as it was beforehand, both in gas and in the tilt as well. So that's the tilt measurement here. So in here is the gas measurements for the past month. We're having more of the data scroll off the chart this way, so we're automatically rescaling, right? So now we're going from 8,000 tons per day down by 1,000 tons per stripe, and 0 is a second to the bottom right in here. So that lowest measurement, maybe I can zoom it in to this bar section here, was a 250. And the one that's happened since then and a couple before that were both in this between 1 and 3,000 tons per day range right in there. So that's the gas. You see that in that 1 to 3,000, it's a similar range, maybe slightly lower than what we had previously in a month. And it's quite a bit different than we saw previously to the 16th or so, when it was actually up in that, coming down to those values, but still you had the 7,000 and the 6,000 and higher values at that point. So the long-term trend does seem to be down, but it seems to also have these correlations. If we were to measure it continuously, we might actually see the same kind of dip as we saw in the tilt meter. And We just have to kind of fill in the gaps there, right? So that is consistent anyways, even if we don't have quite enough data to nail it down exactly. So looking at the depth of the lava lake over the past week first here, there has been a couple of these interesting little jumps going down, going up here. There may be some of those pieces of rock that are floating along the lake surface that are coming into the path, and this is the pattern we've seen before with this kind of gems, this kind of pattern there. So something drifted into view of the laser, but that thing that drifted into view is still rising itself. So if that's one of those rocks, it's being lifted up with the crust and with the lake level, or however it actually is manifesting dynamically that way. And what's interesting is you can see that the pattern is slightly different on a depth compared to what we saw in a tilt. Let me flash the tilt on the screen again. Tilt's got this high point there, and it's a low point here. And if I flash it back to the depth, you can see that during high point is when it starts rising the most steeply. And during the low point, it basically stabilizes and stays flat. And actually, you can see it seems to recede a little bit afterwards before that other piece jumps in its way here. Our scale is 0.5 meter per hash mark through here. So you can see that the size of the block that's drifting into view here is not quite 1 meter tall, which is an interesting thing here. And maybe we're coming across other blocks as well. It's harder to know what's going on with this, but really the long-term trend, if we were to zoom it out, which we'll show you in a bit, averages out all those smaller bumps, and you can see the long-term pattern of essentially increasing coming up here. Right, so but maybe with a slight decrease, and then coming up more so. Okay, so zooming into the lowest down-drop block, this is the B1 camera here, and in the last 24 hours, view loop on a webcam's automatically generated time-lapse. And we can see here is in the last 24 hours that this, starting overnight, this big flash happens in the dark here, is that one of these ooze-up flows that's occurring on this boundary between the crust of the lava lake and this lowest down-drop block. That boundary is actually right in here. And normally you've had this cliff that occurs elsewhere along the crater, everywhere on the side, but in this one little notch right in here, finally the lava's come up high enough that it can actually come up of that crack and flow both ways, right? That way and that way. So you are seeing this black perimeter flow, especially right in here, coming out, right? That's the final extent there. You can see it surges forward in a few hours here in the overnight hours, and by morning you can see quite a different view from when it pops up. So that's a short-term view. We'll come back to this a little bit more detail soon as well. But just focusing on his most recent changes, here's the KW camera viewed back. Let's go back to this B1 camera. Let me zoom it out so you can see what we're looking at here. There is that area we're just zoomed into right in here, with the west vent up here in this far upper corner. So we're at the far end, right? And you can see the lava is going underneath the crust all the way. And you can see new cracks and new glow emerging at other places through here to actually pop it out on the edge here and flow it over onto that lowest down drop block. So the reverse angle is a zoomed out view with the west vent now at the bottom, the active lava lake surface here in the foreground, as it's been stable over the last 24 hours or so. And that lower down drop ledge is back over here in this corner right in there. There is that notch. And you can see there is that flash of that ooze-up flow in the perimeter there. You see there's a second one over here as well, and there may be other ones that are not quite visible based on the camera angle. So zooming into that low spot in there, you can pan it over here. See, there's that low ramp edge right there, that lowest down drop block. There's that flashing that begins farther over and works its way across. And that's the flow that's making that little lobe right in here, pretty much. So that's the overflow. That's the most recent change there. So looking at the last 24 hours on a thermal camera, you can see a more stable active lake surface over here. You see in the thermal that same ooze-up flow in the background coming up through here, right? That whole eastern wall apparently, and then a little bit here in the south as well. You see leaking out, and not as much from this northern edge that we can tell. And really we can't see down too far in the west. We don't really see any glow or anything down there either, though. So the active surface now is stable, but you may notice that we no longer have this arm that goes off to the south, the southern arm that we used to talk about, and this northeastern arm that we used to talk about that extended further over. like these rabbit ears that came off the lava lake, right? So now it's come back to more of this oval shape. It's perhaps because we know that this piece of the crust has been rising, and that may allow that lava to recede by gravity, right, to the lower spot down over here, closer to the vent. But it's not exactly clear what the dynamics are. Everything is moving in there. It's hard to keep one thing relative to the other. So that's what's going on there. As far as the active surface area, we'll look at that in comparisons to the December 2020 eruption next, and we can do that by looking at the USGS release maps. So there's a map released just today, November 11th, and it shows, let me zoom into it here, shows in red, the red area as the active lava surface. This orangish area right in there is the west vent area. The yellows are the islands from the previous eruption, right? This one, in fact, was the island during the eruption, and this was that west vent, which all the material floated up and made its own island at the start of this eruption. And then previous islets as well from then. And I've gone back and reread this caption, and it may correspond, in fact, to where this trench was occurring early on, but this purple line that's marked on here is indicated as the extent of the 2020 eruption, I presume by the end of May earlier this year. So you can see just in diameter visually how much we've grown in area outwards, right? Because we're covering a lot more area now. I think we have at least another 20 acres or so that's been added in the perimeter as the lake is coming up. So besides the actual map, we have statistics released through the 10th at 12 p.m. here. And at this point in time, by this mapping group, you see 802 meters above sea level, which corresponds to 2631 feet. Coming up 59 meters, or 194 feet, almost 200 feet there, almost 60 meters. And coming up to 7.7 billion gallons, or 29.3 million cubic meters. 29.3 being our latest number from the mapping team, which is releasing these data most often. So one of the data sets we're going to use here. Active lake area is down to 17 acres. It was up, I want to say, around 31 last week. And a full extent is 155 acres. And we may be gaining 1 or 2 acres per week kind of thing as the whole surface rises and spreads out into that flared out crater. So there are the volumes in hectares as well. So because we're getting these volumes periodically now, we have one from now and we have one from last week, we essentially can subtract the volumes and we can calculate then the difference in volume, and we know how long it's been since the last map timestamp. We can calculate eruption rates from that, and we can compare the rates and the volumes that way. So we'll just update what we did last week a little bit here because we have a little bit more data. There's 2 lines here. The blue line is the last eruption, December 2020, and the red line is September 2021. So our newest point here, 17 active acres down from 30. That was down from 41 that actually had peaked at 134 acres that were all liquid at the same time. So at that time, taking all the records there. Right, but after that initial early peak, crusting over fairly quickly, and then more slowly, but still coming down to a point where you can see at the similar number of days into the eruption of December 2020, we were slightly higher, but within a couple acres as well. So really following a very similar pattern here, where we came up quickly and then coming down, and coming up more quickly, coming down more quickly, but now leveling out to be pretty close to the same trajectory. So if it follows the same pathway, you might expect it to trail off at that similar kind of rate, right? Kind of crusting over a little bit more as the weeks go on and on. But of course, that's just taking that as an example. That's not guaranteed it's how it's going to go. It's just our most recent example that's working with the same dynamics, pretty close to what we have today. So probably the most relevant, since everything before 2018 has to have a caveat that things have changed since then. And so this is, for example, that previous map on November 4th. You can see that at that point it was 28.2 million cubic meters. So to start things off, let's put it in perspective with 2018. The red line is our current eruption, so our most recent data point of 29 is right here, up from 28, right? This is following a very similar path as the blue line you see right above it. That's the eruption from December 2020. The orange and yellow are 2018. The orange is the lava. The yellow is the withdrawal of lava from magma from Halemaʻumaʻu summit area. So just to show that we did have a slower start in 2018, but we saw that the withdrawal of magma was faster, so we knew that there was more to come. And when it did come, both the rate of lava effusion and of withdrawal of magma from the summit as the summit collapsed essentially skyrocketed upwards, and see that happen fairly quickly into the eruption, maybe a third of the way through it, for example, 30 of the 90 days of that 2018 eruption, whereas we're now past 45 days into our 2021 eruption, and we're following a pattern from before. So really the 2021 and 2020 eruptions are their own different kind of thing from 2018. It's not really like 2018 at all. And to really just show it one more time here, maybe you can see there's a yellow line here, and I'll make it red. This is the 2018 cumulative rate of volume coming out, right? So started coming out like kind of slow, and then it got faster, and then faster and faster and faster, and more kept coming out as time went on, to by the end of the eruption, even those big surges were really putting out a huge amount of lava with each event. 2021, we don't have the data analyzed for the very beginning quite yet here. And even for 2020, it's a little bit suspicious what the actual number is, but we do know it peaks up higher and then comes back down, and tails off as eruption goes on at a lower rate for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks. And our eruption in 2021 is following that similar pattern, peaking early at some value and then coming down, and we're following once again almost the exact same value. Right there, we're essentially right on line, or almost exact same as what we saw for December 2020. So, and just to recap, in recent history since 1790, 70% of the eruptions have been at the summit, and the ones eruptions move out of the summit into one of the rift zones usually go into that upper and middle east rift, like Maunaloa and Pu'o'o areas right through here. Work goes 25% of the time, with only 2% of eruptions going down to the lower east rift zone and 3% to the southwest rift. So very few eruptions make it to those lowest parts of the rift zone. We don't have any reason to believe that anything like that's happening now, and we can still be fairly assured in the events of right now not indicating any change, right? We know long-term what the prognosis is, that it's bound to happen someday, but there's no sign of it happening anytime imminently here. And just to drive this point home, here is a GPS from across Pu'o'o over the last year, showing contraction of the rift zone at that area. Sometimes faster, sometimes not as fast, but the net overall contracting continuously for well over the last year now. So that's what the data is showing. In fact, so really focusing on the fact that 2021 is much like 2020. And here's a close-up of our 29 and our 28, and this is a plot of the volume as it grew over time, right? Of course, we have that same kind of flare geometry concern here, but that affects the depth measurements, as how much depth you gain over each increment of time. But looking at the raw volume overall, we don't have to concern ourselves with that, so we can compare it more directly here. You can see that we're coming out at a slightly lower volume still here. Our eruption is still a little bit smaller in September 21 than it was in December 2020. So December 2020 being the larger eruption, slightly, marginally, this far here. Maybe I should zoom that in, so if anyone is looking on a smaller screen here, they can maybe get a better view of that. And so there's that one. Okay, as far as the rate between the intervals, right? If we say, okay, just between this map and that map, and not taking the whole eruption as a whole, which is what we just did in the last graph, then once again we're following a similar trend. Here we are between last week's and this week's. We come out at 1.8 cubic meters per second in net, which is still something you could sustain for a long time, as was the case during the Pu'o'o era. Recently, in a 4, there's some error in here depending which values you go with. You might get a 3.3 value fairly recently for an interval that's a little bit longer. So. But we're talking about with any error here, we're talking about 2, 3, 4 cubic meters per second. Somewhere in that range is where we are, as opposed to starting off earlier, where we're at least at 28 and likely peaking much higher at some point at the beginning of the eruption there. But following the exact same pattern in 2021 as in 2020. And so here is the full crater time lapse. You can see a little bit better the larger extent of the lava lake with those arms. You can be seen to withdraw before the whole thing hiccups and flashes back over. So all the way from the beginning, there is a whole raising of lava. You can see this eastern crust getting flooded and then essentially rising back out of there. You still see extensive arms around the central island. And with some amount of pulsing, you can see in there, you can see a distinct entry point that goes from very large to small or to larger. And that's the whole sequence right there. So not to repeat it too much, but just to put it in perspective with December 2020, here's December 2020 as it began there. And filled the whole crater, crusted over on that back eastern part more quickly. The lava lake surface receded to a smaller area, eventually crusted all the way over, even as ooze-ups continued around a perimeter. And so that's the whole 2020 for comparison. So once again, is a possibly the pattern that it follows, or it could deviate in some way that we're yet to see still here. So one last point to make here is that with this lake surface of 802 meters above sea level, we are still measuring that mostly. I mean, that may be an average elevation across the whole thing, or maybe a maximum in this higher area of the lava lake right through here. And we know that because we've been having reports from the USGS of the inclination, right, of the higher elevation of the western end of this lava lake from the eastern end here. It's been recently in the range of 20 or so feet, maybe 6 meters, something like that. But not enough to prevent the lava from going onto this bench, but just delaying it a little bit, right? So it's increasing in depth more quickly by the vent and gradually going underneath the crust and uplifting it and then oozing out here a little bit with a little bit of a delay. And so this map is not showing much of an overflow onto there yet, and that's way too big from how I drew it. But you may remember from our coverage from our last eruption here, we pulled out and we drew a 800 meter contour from the December 22nd, 2020 map here on our topography back then, just for comparison here. And you can see we have a very, very similar outline of the lava lake to what it is now. The biggest difference being this lobe that's on a downdrop block over here to the side. Right? And so that's the point where if it was level all the way across, you might expect it to have that kind of shape. But in fact, it's not. And so this is what may be coming within the next few days and weeks as this back side catches up to the near vent side here further and further as lava keeps coming into the crater. So here's the full sequence from the B1 camera looking from the east. The downdrop block is over here on the right. This is a spot that eventually the lava comes up to and overflows. This is from the beginning of the eruption when everything is still crusted over. So we'll play the whole sequence here for you guys from the B1 camera. You see it flooding the whole crater. This is daytime view only, so you just see it as silver, but it's the movement you're looking for. So no more movement here in the foreground. It's all here in the back, all through there. But you do see the lava level coming up through the ooze-ups here in the foreground throughout that whole time. The whole sequence there. Drag it back and forth a few times so you can see it a little bit more quickly. I think it's a little more impressive to see that pistoning sequence there of that crater floor lifting up and down. A pretty amazing thing to bear witness to here. All right, let's keep moving on. And yeah, once again, that's that leaking out there. Bring it back around here just to show that, right? And one thing I didn't point out in as much detail, but if we pan it back over here to see closer to the west vent, and see how far I can zoom out there. There we go. You see that near this islet right in here, there's a spot of glow that actually seems to flash open and appears right before we see the flash open of this ooze-up over here. So you can see it's almost like a pressure wave comes across the lake. It actually squeezes out through some cracks somewhere in here. It looks like there might be a small flow or something right in there. It's hard to exactly tell, but I wouldn't be surprised if there's a new little pad of lava right in there. And then shortly afterwards, it pops up on this side and flows up and starts lapping onto the crater right through there. So that's that last aspect of the recent changes to talk about here. And here's the last month overall. So here's the little variations we talked about just recently, the ups and downs of possible pieces of rock floating across the laser path. But the overall pattern here for the last month is pretty clear. Was coming up pretty steadily. You can see this recent slowdown that just happened, a little hiccup that we had, and then now it seems to be picking back up again. Right? So this was our little hiccup right through here, and looking similar before and after now. Just a few more data points to step through before we address some of the questions here, and we'll just look at the deformation data. In the last 2 days, our tilt hasn't changed really that much at all. We have essentially a half a microradian scale across the whole top to bottom. So you see a lot more, it looks a lot more noisy and wiggly. That's only because it's zoomed in so far. Because really, when you look at the context of the last week here, on a 3.5 microradian scale, which is still not that large, you can see those small variations are just small up and downs. And we've talked about how we might have seen some of these gas pistonings before, right? And essentially that's kind of what we saw here is a big release of gas and lava and then a decrease afterwards, and then the resumption of it once again. In perspective of the last month here, you see back almost a month ago, we have having these I don't know, maybe 2 microradian or so deflation inflation cycles. And you see we had this pulse right through here that came up 2.5 microradians as well, maybe 2 microradians as well. So there's been gas movement and possibly these little small surges of lava happening for a while, but not to the extent of what we saw here, not to the peak and not to the trough that we just saw. So interesting to see that no matter how you take this, we can no longer say that it's been continuous. We're now starting to see some small interruptions for whatever reason, which is something that happened in the last eruption as well. We did see some pulsing and interruptions as well. As eruption progressed on further and event was drowned further, and maybe we're seeing similar patterns today. So that is the tilt. Looking at the GPS across the summit extension here, we can see that it's been a little bit flatter. Maybe it's starting to pick back up. This may correspond to that slight little decrease, but overall it's definitely not decreasing. It's extending, stabilizing, and possibly starting to extend a little bit more here, but responding more slowly to these changes since it's the GPS with only 1 point a day. So, but still, it's not showing anything major changing there. We imagine there's still magma coming into the system here. It's not all able to get out, and that's the pattern over the last 5 years here. So, in comparison, 2021, 2020, and 2018. It's wholly different animals here. All right, let's move on to the earthquakes. This is earthquakes over the last week. You can see not a lot of earthquakes around the summit caldera region right through here. There is a cluster of deeper ones, which are interesting between this deep mantle plume pathway and the summit. So maybe there's some recharge of magma. That's typical to see earthquakes in those lower crustal areas after eruptions put out a lot of output. So it's just there's nothing imminent. Sometimes these happen without any actual change in the output at the surface, right? It's just part of the plumbing, but nothing can directly relate to surface output, really. So interesting to note that they occur. There's still active plumbing happening from the hotspot to the volcano, but no surface effects coming out of that. Otherwise, all you see is the south flank earthquakes that seem to just go on regardless of what week it is and what else we're talking about. This is the one constant every update has pretty much. We talk about how these south flank earthquakes are still going at their regular rate here. So that's the earthquakes, pretty low. 289 in the week, right? And a good amount of those in this Pahala region down through here, and above it, and the areas responding as well. So there's no increased concern in this area. There's still a lot of puzzles about what's going on down here, but really no further insight or hazard to really discuss today. Right. As far as the rates, over the last month, we're looking at earthquakes per day. We peaked above 60 per day, but really that's not a whole lot. You can see it's been below 60 per day for much of the last month, and that's much lower than the amounts previous to eruption, and then a buildup and all of that as well. All right, so VOG is still happening and still impacting. So let's see if I wonder if this will actually animate. Here's our SO2 animation of VOG today. So here's our source, Kilauea. You can see it's mostly coming to the southwest, but it does get into the saddle a little bit here. And you can see it wrapping around to some of the areas of Waimea and then upper Kona, Waikoloa areas as well, right? Depending on the shift in the winds that we're just seeing here, right? Winds shifting over, VOG blowing back around, right? That's the SO2. SO2 is the more of the native gas that comes out, and of course, as it goes through the air and reacts with the atmosphere, you can also have more of that particulate VOG, the haziness in the air from the SO4. And you can see there's a SO4 forecast as well. You can see Hilo is forecast to be getting it. See this here is the 11th. That's today. So it's forecasting given the climate inputs from the Mauna Kea Weather Center from University of Hawaii. It steps forward here. And this is tomorrow at noon, right? So projecting a shift in winds and a VOG coming across Hilo side tomorrow. Purple air is supporting those data. That right now it's mostly on the Kona side, but we probably will see this on the Hilo side tomorrow as well. But you can see there's persistently high values no matter when you look. There's lingering VOG all across there, right? So unfortunately, that one day little hiccup and decrease in the emissions didn't really carry over. There's still, at last report, 2,600 tons per day coming out of the volcano of SO2. We have the State of Hawaii Air Quality website as well, and let's see if I can get it to show some values. Values, please. There are some, and they're all showing in a green, but as usual, if you go and click on one, you can scroll through the history and see that, it's flirting with the yellows and sometimes even higher than that, depending which day and wind direction, of course, right? And so certainly the VOG impact is notable. For most people, unless you're in a sensitive group, it's maybe a slight nuisance, but it could also make for more colorful sunsets and that kind of thing. So just looking on the bright side a little bit there, because it looks like the VOG is going to keep coming out. And so one last thing to talk about here, because it's more relevant to the eruption today than other weeks, is a volcano watch this week, tracking magma movement using olivine crystal clocks. Not to read through it entirely, but there have been samples collected of olivines. This is from December 2020 eruption, and this is from our September 2021 eruption right through here. And what they're pointing out here is that these olivines have high magnesium content cores with rims that are low magnesium content. And similar things here in December 2020 and in September 2021. So they're looking similar in a microscope. If you're looking at them in a plain light, it might look something more like this. This is the 52 olivine from Maunaloa. So those are the crystals themselves, but when you look through, you can actually start looking at different compositional patterns, almost like tree rings. And, did the tree grow better in this year or that year because of how fat the ring is, and what's the ring made of? So it's that kind of thing, but looking at the crystals themselves. So what this means essentially is that the core of this olivine grew at some deeper part of the volcano, came up to a shallower level, and then grew for a limited time. They're saying 60 days it grew to get this rim that you see all around it here. Right? That's the rim of it. It grew around it within 60 days of it actually erupting in December 2020. And it looks very similar here. You do see similar core with a rim for our September 2021 eruption as well. So would not be surprised to have that same pattern that was found for December 2020 to also be true here for September 2021. And so here's what it says here. 60 days before, based on, and this is based on a couple of things, right? So, I mentioned the different compositions, right? But there's also what I should mention to be more detailed and accurate is the diffusion. You have diffusion of this higher magnesium values into this outer glass, and the diffusion time gives you some kind of essentially a clock, right? That's what they're calling a crystal clock that can give you a timeline of how long this rim had to grow for this thing to diffuse into it. And that's where that 60-day value comes from. So that's really amazing, fascinating stuff to get that 60-day value. That's the highlight result of this, right? There's no result for 2021 yet, but you would expect something perhaps similar, right? Maybe not exactly 60, but you'd imagine on the order of 1 to 2 months kind of thing beforehand. And if they talk about how 60 days before December 2020 was a set of earthquakes that began under Namakani Paio, northwest of the summit of Kilauea, right between a Kilauea Maunaloa boundary there, right? So that was our, in hindsight now, the sign that was likely that injection of magma into the summit region, causing that adjustment between the volcanoes, causing the beginning of that era of all those extra summit earthquakes that kept occurring until it eventually popped out 60 days later. And so that gives us some pattern of it as well. So here is the last month's plot of earthquakes for the last year. And so you actually have October 2020 right in here. This is the beginning of that seismic period that begins right through here, and that leads up to more earthquakes and eventually eruption happening at the end of December, right through there. So fast forwarding to ours, we had all this period of low earthquakes during eruption that we had in 2020, and then when eruption ended, then an earthquake background resumed, and we started having more adjustments at the summit with this intrusion that occurred. And so let me advance it to our current last year's slide, and so our October scrolls off the graph over here. But we did peak over 1,200 earthquakes per week that 1 week of the intrusion, and then followed it up with that activity that began the eruption at the end of September, right through here. And then now we're back in this low rate, which is similar to what we saw back in 2020, right? So really 2020 and 2021, very, very similar patterns. And we might well find that the magma from this intrusion that occurred 60 days-ish before, maybe 30 days-ish before the eruption actually begins here, maybe what causes those rims to grow. And we'll eagerly await those results from USGS HVO and appreciate that Volcano Watch article today. All right, so just for me to note here, this is all coming from USGS. This is all USGS data. We're kind of synthesizing it so you guys don't have to read the updates every day and look through all the pages and all that, and try to make it somewhat flow as a story for you guys here. But this is all, once again, mahalo to the USGS for making all this stuff available. So with that, Dane, we can turn to our first set of questions, discussions, mahalos,
right,
and what have you.
Yeah, so let's get into that. First, I want to take the opportunity to thank the viewers that have turned in today. Sorry for the dog who apparently seen something outside. But thank you for all the viewers. You guys really do help keep this channel going. Like, subscribe, share, all that really does help the channel grow. We also post our content on hawaiitracker.com, and that is where you can go to find our content in chronological order, as well as our video content and written content, links to all that. We are brought to you by a couple supporters or companies that support us, businesses. First one is Kīlauea's Bar and Grill. They with their establishment in Pahoa and newly opened establishment in Orchid Land. It really does do some really great service and cuisine there. It's a restaurant that does a little bit of a unique twist with on some traditional dishes with a little local flair. They have indoor, outdoor dining, takeout options. The menus at both establishments are different, so you can go to both of them and get different options. So definitely check out Kīlauea's Bar and Grill, and we appreciate them. Second one is Kalani Tours out of Kona, and they offer a few different kinds of tours. The first ones are the waterfall and Kona Coffee Farm tours, but they also do lava tours as well. So if you want to get the insight and get a little personalized tour of the Kilauea summit and see that active lava lake right now, this would be the perfect time, and Kalani Tours would be happy to have you. And we thank them for their support as well. All right, so we do have some questions to get into. Just dive into those. Pierre asked, what would the lava lake, if it were to drain, look like? What level could it go down to? could it ever get down to back where we're seeing the water at the bottom of the pit that was the collapse from 2018?
Yeah, that's a great question. Something great thing to discuss is, we can kind of speculate. We don't really know because we don't know what the cracks look like down over there, right? But presuming that crack that occurred in that southern wall of the crater does go across that crater bottom, for example, and the lava can drain down through there. Let's say that actually is possible. The next thing you need is somewhere for it to drain that's lower than that. So unless you had some kind of big earthquake to like make a whole bunch of space underground all at once, it's hard to imagine how you'd get that extra space right there. Apart from having a vent open up lower down on a volcano, like on a rift zone somewhere down, right? So if, for example, Pu'u'o was erupting, then you could drain down to the elevation of the vent somewhere by Pu'u'o, right? And I would have to compare exactly the elevation of that water level to Pu'u'o. I think it's still below there, so I'm not sure it could drain that far down. But if you had a vent somewhere that's far enough down, then that's what it would take. And that kind of gets at why 2018 was so devastating, was that the Leilani event was so far down in elevation that allowed a huge amount of that gravity to drive the eruption just based on an elevation differential, right? So without it opening that far down, something like that, it's hard to imagine it draining that far down again, essentially, is my answer. And since eruptions only go down to that part of the rift zone very rarely, 1 in 50, I would be surprised to see it drain down that far before. I'd rather expect it to fill up more and more and more and more and more until, fill up, cover one ledge and cover another ledge and cover another ledge. And maybe there's a small eruption somewhere in the Upper East Rift Zone or in the Middle East Rift Zone, and it drains down a little bit on the surface, and it dimples itself, and then it refills that dimple and that kind of thing. That's what the historical pattern seems to indicate, rather than it draining all the way out. That's pretty rare and unusual to see, and was really a rare thing for us to live through in 2018.
Right, and I also think there's two different types of draining almost being mentioned, at least as where I'm looking at it, where you have the draining of the magma chamber like in 2018, right? But you also have the draining of the lava lake back into the system, right, at the surface level. And I'm not exactly sure which the question is, regarding.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose in 2018, and this is a question that we're not sure how true it is now, but like, how well connected is a lava lake to that magma chamber? Because in the past, the lava lake acted as a piezometer, as a pressure indicator of the the level of pressure within the magma chamber, right? It essentially was a natural measure of it. And if this one is doing the same thing, then, well, yeah, how do you make the space back in a system for it to occur is really the big question. That's hard to happen within a summit unless you take it somewhere else, right? Either you take it somewhere else or you have a bigger earthquake to make more space, and that's kind of your options. You can't just magically make more space under there.
Mm-hmm. Right. You have
to have some mechanism. Those are the ones that historically work, right?
Yep. All right. Well, good. We got another question here. This is actually, I'm going to combine several questions and make it into one. It's all about the vent and the evolution and what might be expected there over the next couple of weeks. That western vent on the caldera wall or the crater wall. How do you project that it will evolve over the next couple of weeks? Do you think it could last until the new year? And what was the last bit? Do you know, is there any indications in it that it might extinguish itself? Like just cease erupting there?
It's that, who knows? Who knows? I mean,
right.
We'll show some pictures of how the 2020 event progressed as a possible analog. We can kind of recap by showing that progression. We can show a little bit of the progression of the event so far this year, but we'll have a full compilation of that coming probably next week. And yeah, I mean, it's at 1 to 4 cubic meters per second. It's not a huge volume. It's enough to keep oozing out so long as there's a pathway for it to do so, right? It can kind of just keep trickling for a while at that lower kind of rate, like the later years of Pu'u'o, like the later phases of the December 2020 eruption earlier this year. and how the vent changes is really interesting, right? I mean, I don't know. It seems like the vent is fully submerged already, and it's bubbling up through the middle of that spatter cone, which is also lifting with a lake that is being buoyed by the lava that's coming out of the vent. So it's all really weird and complicated. You know, if that thing shifts a little bit, and let's say that doesn't line up anymore, and the lava can't just shoot straight out of that hole, then it can just lift the whole vent upwards and just flow into the lake below it. And so, you know, the pattern what we've seen so far is what I can recount with most confidence, right? We saw it go from having sustained higher, it's hard, you can't call it high fountaining because it was only, you know, maybe 200 feet at the most kind of thing, you know, but higher fountaining, right? Sustained moderate fountaining to lower fountaining with higher bursts, to no more bursts, to no more fountaining, but just lower roiling and bubbling with spatter, to not coming out at all, to now going back to some more spatter, right? So the pattern has been of less and less stuff shooting above the wall of it. So, you know, as was the case in the last eruption, we might eventually just see some kind of pathway just from the edge of the lake where the lava comes in, and then that cone and hill just stays parked off to the side, like the last eruption. That's my best guess, just based on what we saw the last time. But any ideas, Dan? Anything you want to add to that?
No, I think you basically summed that one up. It's really hard to know, and with the added caveat of the whole top lifting up. I mean, even the analog from 2020 is got a big old asterisk next to it in like bright, you know, red. So it's just really hard, especially when you know, like we saw that hiccup happen on Monday, and it was like, oh, maybe it's starting to turn off, and then it turned back on and hasn't done that again, right, since then. So it's really hard to tell.
Yeah, I mean, but you know, it's when you start seeing variations, then you know, it's no longer just staying on indefinitely. It's doing something different, and you know, even you know, you can talk about 2018 and when we started to see the pulsation and started to see the surges and started to see those variations. You know, we were able to start progressing. Okay, like here's a cycle, and a cycle is slowing down, and this is changing towards a conclusion at some point. It may be a long, drawn-out conclusion, but it's the first signal of something different in an evolution of the pattern, right? So even if it's not, you know, like, oh, it didn't turn off all the way, yeah, it's true, but it turned off a little bit for the first time, and that's noteworthy.
Right. So I had a question ask you myself. Didn't spring this one on you beforehand, but that signal on Monday night, I was looking at and thinking about it a little more, and we've talked previously about DI cycles, right? But we've talked about the weird ones, like the DID cycle, the deflation, inflation, deflation cycle. And the weird thing of just looking at it more and more, I was like, was that like a weird inflation, deflation, inflation type thing where during the deflationary part, we stopped seeing that surface activity? So it was almost like gas related, gas driven. I don't know. I wanted to see what your thoughts on that were.
Yeah, it's really tricky because the whole eruptive cycle of volcanoes is essentially like an inflation deflation cycle, right? That's kind of the first order pattern of volcanoes. It inflates as it builds up magma, and it deflates as it puts out lava, right? That's kind of the first order. And then we talk about deflation inflation cycles as like a separate process that kind of, why would it be in the opposite order and break that pattern? It's like, okay, because it's a separate process that's driven by some other mechanism of gas and fluid movement, right? But when it comes down to it, I think can only inflate or deflate, right? As a computer scientist, right, it's either a 0 or a 1, right? It's very rarely staying put, right? So we can start going inflation, deflation. We can start putting any sequence of string of these together and come up with. Right. And at some point, we really, it's hard to go beyond just the DI cycle and everything else, whether it's a DID or IDI or, I start getting lost myself because it's and I prefer to go into the whole, there's likely some process with the gas and fluid going on once again, right? And some different geometries, right? Like how big is the pathway? Is it a cylinder? Is it a plane, like a sheet, right? Or, those kind of things.
All right. Yeah, that was just my thoughts on it, just thinking about it over the past couple of days. Jennifer asked about the EQ swarms, earthquake swarms, prior to this eruption. That we first were talking about them on the East Rift Zone, and then we had activity peak up at the seismic Southwest Rift. And she's wondering why it erupted inside the caldera instead of at either of those two locations.
So those are essentially the edges of the whole summit complex, right? And I think it erupted out of the center of the complex. So imagine the pressure is probably highest in the center, and it's high on the edges also, right? It's propagates from the middle outwards, and on the edges it's got to reach that point to actually break through and make more space for itself. That's what happened in the Southwest Rift, and we saw those earthquakes. And it was to a small degree at the edges of the Upper East Rift as well. That's why all those earthquakes are happening there. But and I think the Southwest Rift kind of add a little more to that. Like it actually opened up a little bit extra space in there with that intrusion and all of that, and that kind of expanded the reservoir a little bit. And essentially, if you hadn't done that, you would have had that first eruption. The eruption would have began back then during that intrusionary pulse. But so the pressure center in the middle perhaps was able to find that weakest spot above it, right, faster than it was able to find it to the surface on those edges, right? So it was able to inject laterally, but still deep underground in a Southwest Rift, whereas it was able to go towards the surface, which is a different direction, right, with the pressure from the center. So there's just some observations, I'm sure we could go into more detail and add more to that. Than that, I feel like I'm missing some components there, but those elements I'd consider in discussing that. Yeah.
All right, this last question we'll do for this segment of Q&A. We'll try and do one more at the end. Is from Brenda, who's asking about the cracks in Leilani and around the Lower East Rift Zone. Says, so what do you guys do with the cracks that Akaika showed people in the backyards and etc.? Can you fill them back in or cover with blacktop or just leave them alone? Do they move at all? I can take that one. Or
yeah, I think this one's for you, Dane.
Yeah. So a lot of those cracks have obviously remained after the eruption. They just, the cracks that were steaming remained steaming. Cracks that remained hot. There is changes that happen though over time, right? So some of these cracks have gotten slightly wider. We've seen the steam change from coming out of one very specific crack to maybe a crack that's a few feet over to the side. We've seen the areas that are hot, that are consistently hot over months and months or over years, start to migrate or shift the hotspot to a slightly different area. So it's always weird. And when that hotspot shifts, that kills all the vegetation around it, right? So everything will be green away from a very specific crack, and then that you'll just see the death start to creep over, and that the steam's going to start coming out of another spot pretty soon. And the cracks they're not big shifts, right? In the beginning of the eruption, it was like inches a day type crack movement that we were talking about. Now it's really hard to tell if they're actually moving or anything along those lines. You're getting pretty precise, so it's hard to say like, oh, it moved this much. But yeah, they do move. You can try and fill them with the fill, right? You throw a bunch of dirt or cinder or whatever else in them. It's just that, like with each earthquake, as we saw with Highway 11, when they were during the collapse events, when an earthquake happens, you can kind of jiggle the fill, and it all filters a little bit further down and ruins the clean surface that you just made. But yeah, otherwise they're mostly the same, unchanged from day to day, month to month, year to year. Yeah, that's my attempt at that one.
Yeah, it seems like changing faster early on and not as much since. And I haven't noticed. Dan lives in the area, so he knows he's the person to listen to there. I haven't noticed anything.
We haven't been posting anything, but I've been going out to a few spots every once in a while, getting calls, and they'll say like, "Oh, it's been here, but now it's here." Right? I've been, I come here every day, and this moved, and it's not a big change, but it's just one of those things. Like, all right, well, mental note: that one moved, that one moved, that one moved. Slightly. type thing. All right. Well, I think that does it for the first Q&A segment. We'll pass it back to you, and we will collect some more questions for the final segment.
Sounds good. I see we have a bunch of Maunaloa questions coming in. We're going to talk about Maunaloa a little bit here to start off our second segment. We'll catch up a little bit on what's going on in Maunaloa, which is not a whole lot, but yeah, we're not going to be able to get into today the long-term production rates of Maunaloa and Kilauea. We have talked about that a little bit in the past. I'm not sure if we have a highlight of that, Dane. If not, we'll have to bring that presentation back around in the future to compare for you guys. I got the charts all somewhere, but it's a lot easier to explain with charts and all that. So, but yeah, each individual eruption of Maunaloa can be quite a bit bigger. And Maunaloa, to summarize it, like has had eras that are much more productive and eras that are a lot less productive, right? So really, it's been a lot less productive since 1950, since Kilauea started back up, and before that, it was much more active. So that's the short and skinny of that, right? I'm going to start off here by looking at the webcam view of Maunaloa from the summit. It's all still quiet up there. It's still beautiful. Nice wide caldera up there. Yeah, Maunaloa still in her coma, Nathan. Yeah. We'll see when she wakes up. It's showing a little bit of signs of something a little bit different here, but nothing quite major yet. So earthquake rates over the past year in Maunaloa. We're over here. You can see we had a slight little bump, getting up over 100 earthquakes per week, close to it for a few weeks, but just last week dropping back down to around 70 or so. So very, very small little increases here, right? You know, kind of small in the context of the last year, where back in December 2020, we started really having the beginning of these sequence of 3 big swarms of earthquakes kind of came together right through there, right? So in comparison, anything over the last year, it's pretty small still. You can see it was a little bit lower, come up a little bit, but really it's nothing compared to before, right? We'll look at more context of it here shortly, but the Maunaloa update today only states 69 small magnitude earthquakes below magnitude 3, majority below sea level, no appreciable movement anywhere else. Information, GPS, gas, temperatures, webcam is nothing like that. So there's not a whole lot in there. It's not a whole lot of change. We can look at the GPS here for the last year, and you can see that after our changes that began in December, I showed you the earthquake swarms. The GPS started taking off then, and culminating in late March and early April with a big kind of contraction, right? And so essentially, this is a big pulse of magma came into the volcano, and the volcano was adjusting and stretching to accommodate it, and that it pretty much completed the job, finished the job by mid-April or so. And since then, it has been pretty steady, flat, right? You see some variation, but you know that's maybe part of the noise of the location or instrumentation or the process of it. You know, it's hard, you really don't see any noticeable change until maybe starting in September or so, right? Maybe it's coming up slightly. If so, it's not very fast. It's not, you know, it's similar to something like this. It's not one of these. It's not going on at that kind of rate, right? It's a lot slower than that, right? And for the past year, you can see that, yeah, maybe it's a little bit higher than before, but it's certainly not showing any signs of what it was doing before. For the past month, here are the earthquakes. The 69 earthquakes at the summit is showing a lot more here. 1 week here, or it's actually the whole month, sorry. So over the course of the whole month, you can see similar patterns before, disperse across the upper part of the southeast flank, which is over here, that whole quarter. You see these shallower ones under the upper southwest rift and caldera a little bit, not a whole lot, but you know, a little bit of a cluster more so under here. And you see this more broader cluster to the northwest at the edge of the storage area as well, but nothing really intense. We've seen areas, we've seen the maps before where we couldn't even make out anything below here was all just covered in ink. So really not a whole lot to see there. Right? You can see the rates and depths of the past month here. Very low per day counts. Right? And so just to note, the tilt on Maunaloa, if you're looking at the web pages, has been some things are going wrong with the transmission. Our last date coming in is about a month ago, so the tilt doesn't seem to be updating quite yet there. So, all right, here's the GPS that we just looked at with that small little change right here. And looking back over the past 5 years at this lower plot right in here, you can see there is that little bump that we had from last year is just that much of it, right? So there's that kind of flatter part with that little pulse that came in, and then a flatter part, right? So you almost see almost like separate little pulses coming in small little batches, but overall you can see that it was flatter during before 2018, and then it started extending and then flatter, right? So this whole zone in here is the accumulation of magma coming in and a volcano adjusting to it, right? It kind of began back post 2018 and completed earlier in 2021 here, and we're just still waiting, and maybe we're coming back up to something more like you see 5 years ago, where it was kind of slowly coming up, and maybe it's trickling in there, but it's not really coming in a big batch, and it might stop and adjust, and so we almost see a full cycle here, and we're back in this part of the cycle, awaiting some further sign of more of it coming in, which we're not seeing anything of right now. So that's good news, I'm sure, for everyone living on the slopes of Maunaloa, which are many in our communities here. Looking at the vertical motion, you can see similar kind of pattern. Back in April, there was a drop down, pretty flat, and then maybe starting to rise a little bit here in the last few months, a little bit, right? So, but we saw, of course, just based on what we see for the last 5 years here, how much magma this volcano can accommodate without actually even needing to erupt, right? So it's got a big capacity, and it's nothing to worry about in a short term. Of course, in the long term, we're building awareness of the volcano so that if something does happen, then we can talk about it in meaningful terms. All right, so that is the Maunaloa update here, and so we'll move on to looking at some of the photo and video from Kilauea that's been released. And there are a couple of days of releases to look at here. One is back on November 5th. This is before that decrease in the lava. So you can see here that view of the west vent in daytime, putting out that big chute of lava coming into the lava lake, and that perched area that's only visible as a silvery crust that's a little flatter with these red spots glowing in between it. That's the active surface right in there. Zooming in on the west vent a little more, you can clearly see the spattering within the cone right there, and that long tongue of effusion into the lake, that entry point right there. Okay, and then a little bit different perspective looking from the south here, similar to our S1 camera view. We see a little bit more of the margins of this lake here. So you can see that there were times when through this receding process, you start building up these levees and margins on the edge here. But also, maybe worth pointing out, let me just point out this last image here of the west vent with that chute coming in once again right through here. You see nice arcuate shapes, and some eddies and little whirlpool-like action happening in there. And the spatter so visible up in here, right? But one thing I wanted to point out, let me click through to this one, and all the way through so I can zoom in and point out these chunks of rock that are sitting a little bit higher, right? We saw in our laser graph maybe 1 meter higher. That might be about the size of a rock like that. So as these things drift across a lava lake, that might be what we're seeing as far as the difference in elevation of the depth of the lava lake. Yeah, that's from the 5th. That's from beforehand. We also have a video from a little bit before that. And here is October 29th, and showing these kind of eddies that are comparable to circulation and bodies of water, right? So there's that arcuate shape happening right through there, right? If you look at this margin right in here, you can see those chunks of lava getting pulled out, and the whole thing's rotating and arcing. And this is the latest video from the USGS. As that entry point plunges into the lake, causing these interesting circulation patterns there, and crust and all of that. Zoom it back out here so you get that wider view. And pretty cool stuff. You can see in this upper part, it's like a standing pond right up here at a higher elevation, bubbling in some parts, mostly just flowing out to this exit point and going down this chute popping out there at the lake level. Zoom in on that part for you guys. Oh, that was it there. We'll see a photo of that coming up shortly as well. But just to remind you, if you haven't seen our short video that released last week, then the last week, it had a similar kind of patterns. I'll drag it through here, but you can see at the entry point, similar kind of swirls, nighttime and daytime here occurring in the edges of the entry points there and there. There you can see it swirling in the time-lapse animation. So cool stuff to see, different angles from USGS, and from what this is taken from the public overlook in the national park. So see at this point was a little bit more of an open channel, but still that entry point plunging in and causing that convection through there. All right, so we won't have to go through any more of that, but I just want to point out that comparison there. Okay, so some wide-angle views from the helicopter overflights that occurred last week. And wide-angle view, you see the fume cloud. There's been more clouds at the summit over the last few days, so we're getting better glow. Any visitors to the park are seeing the reflection of the lava lake on the bottom of this cloud. You can see it driving down a highway. You can see it coming into the park as you're hiking out. The overlook, any of those kind of things. A little closer in, our west vents at the back of this photograph back over here. So you really can see the whole, not quite all of it, but a lot of the 150 plus acres of active lake surface right through there. Overflight on the 9th here, a little wider angle view. So this is that closer down drop block in there. So for those of you guys who are imagining when this crater tries to overflow, where it might actually go, right? We're talking about it lapping onto this little wedge right in there. This little thing right in here is where it can go first. And then that next lowest level is right through there, like that. And then the next lowest level includes all of that back there, and all of this in the foreground out through here, like that. And then there's one level above that still, right? That third higher caldera level that goes beyond that, off to the side, off that way. So it's really down deep in there, and it's why it's taken so long to come up into view where we could see it. Focusing more on the west vent here, you can see we've had some questions about how it might actually be changing. You can see in this image there's actually a small little dome fountain at the end after it crusted over, right? So it slowed down enough to crust over this pathway further, and you see that we grew this big spine out over the edge, but then a pressure comes back in, the flow comes back in, and there is that pressure manifesting as a little bit of a dome. Right? You can see that big piece of rock here that seems to be growing horizontally across the face of this entry point. I find interesting. That's one of the newer features, right? Before this was more closed off like this. We didn't really see this knob over here, right? So, and it looks like it maybe getting pushed up from below perhaps as well, right? So you imagine as a pressure can't quite get out and flow out as easily, it might be pushing from below and deforming the base of this west vent as another possibility of what might actually happen as this thing evolves over time here. Slightly different angle. You see that similar piece of rock here in the foreground, a little bit less domey, but still flowing in at the entry point. See some spatter in the background over here. I'll zoom it out so you can get a little bit different perspective here. Different view with there, and then zoomed into that ponded lava surface within the vent, right? Spattering, and now a lot of the spatter is mostly landing against these inner walls, sometimes landing in this upper perimeter around here. So there is a little bit of accumulation on top of this thing. But for the most part, it's just kind of bubbling and going out the hole, out the side, and at the bottom of the thing. So during that lowest output time, there's a photograph, November 8th, from the USGS. You can see how little of that active lava surface actually remains here, just close to the west vent, right here. This is actually when it's sending out a bit of a flow. It's starting to begin to come over here to the south, and it seems like this was the beginning of the restoration of the flow. But you can see how small it was at that point, very near that lowest amount, right? When eventually it's going to reflood the area that goes all the way to here and all to that. So really withdrew quite a bit. And you see a little bit of it here. Still glowing in the west vent during that whole time. The lava never disappeared or anything like that. It was still bubbling and all through there. Just at a lower level. And for comparison, I thought I would dig up, here's a couple of videos from the December 2020, right? So I'm going to pull this back. This was January 8th. This was the same day that the crust, eastern crust formed in the lava lake the first time in the last eruption. And just a video showing how slow the lava was coming out at that point in time. Because at that point in time, you know, not even a month in, we were amazed at how gooey and oozy this lava looked coming out, right? And, you know, that eruption went on for many more months. This one could do the same kind of thing, but as an example of the changes in the vent, it really slowed down quite a bit, where it was just kind of oozing out very slowly during those intervals of time before restoring itself later on. So we'll get more perspective on that here. We'll look at one more video of that era first. See if it'll load here. January 22nd, so this is already 2 weeks after the last video. And this is sped up now, so you can see the essentially pressure cycles, right? You can see it's squirting out more than less, then more than less, and more than less. And interesting little whirlpools and eddies down here at the bottom as well. And this very interesting parallels, right? So more than less. And it was this beginning of this fluctuation of the pressure that we saw in the 2020 eruption as well, that you could say that we were seeing that's the very same pattern at a very similar timeline in eruption as we saw in 2020. So that is that one. And to kind of put it all together, here's a video we re-released, kind of compiling all those changes here, right, from December to January of that entry point of the 2020 eruption into the vent. January 6th, these are all mostly sped up, right? But you can see the standing dome fountain as well, and then really oozy, sped up, but still looking pretty sluggish through there. And then a few days later, coming out pretty good, so it was sloshing in there, reopening the vent, and then pulsing, as we just saw that video. This is really sped up. And then January, earlier this year, we no longer had a spillway, we just had that entry point, and it was also pulsing a bit, and stayed crusting over, and sometimes it would be more of a dome. And the last view we had was essentially this: the margin of the lake was where it would come out and flow into, and essentially the entry point was all submerged beneath the edge of the levee. So that's our analog for what might happen with our vent as well. As is more interesting, what's different is, of course, that the vent is actually floating and is buoying and not getting covered as much as it was last time. So it's starting to deform, and an entry point has got that extra variable beyond the last time as well. All right, so just to point this out, this is the 24-hour time lapse that we showed the last update. This was before that hiccup occurred, but we pointed this out, how we could see these variations in how much lava is coming in just based on the length of this entry point off of the vent. So you can clearly see in this 24-hour interval that I captured, I just saved it from that point in time, right? It's captured by the USGS, where you can really see this within 24-hour variation. Probably pretty similar to that video we just saw, right? So we're starting to see this kind of pulsation as well, pulsing and then shutting all the way off, and very similar patterns as we saw in 2020. And so, very briefly, over the last few weeks, changes within our west vent in 2021, with that spillway crusting over. That's what we have there. An open pathway. You're starting to crust over, crusting all the way over and spilling out the bottom all through there, right? And so that's our pattern, and we'll expand on this with a more complete sequence next week, I hope. So to finish off the pictures here, later, as the flow resumed out of the west vent, you can see here it is during that lower time still, but resuming out, and you can see the lake at a high level and spattering out continuously during the whole time. Big flow starting to move across over here, it's starting to resume its effusion and output. And there are some of these images that show this progression, right? You know, as the lava withdrew, there were more of these topographic ridges and little levees exposed. So as lava came back in to refill the area, it starts cascading over top of those little levees and these small drops here. So this photo is not the one that has the caption of how tall this is, but I think it's the next one that has a similar view from the side. Yeah, here it is. A little bit higher output of lava here, and they do note here the inactive lake surface is about 4 meters or 13 feet lower than an active lake surface. So here's the inactive surface, and here's the active surface. Right, that 13-foot difference is pouring over onto that lower level right there. And so this is it says 10 a.m. on the 9th, that following morning, and 1 hour later at 11 a.m. on the 9th. It's a little overexposed here, but there is that levee. You can barely see it anymore. And this whole lower area has been all flooded with lava coming over top of these areas once again. So it really goes to show it's all coming from that west vent area and flowing over top of that, all this topography. And then there are certain points where it seems to find its way back under the crust to remobilize and rejoin that big mass and ooze up at the other side as well, perhaps. So just to wrap it up here, here is our last 24-hour views from the S1 camera. Maybe you can refresh it a little bit too, so you have more of a current window into what's happening now. And that active lake surface has been steady, similar size. You see one small overflow over that little levee area down into this little south arm bay, maybe this little bay that's formed now. Not anything like that visible, and we really don't see that in the northeast arm whatsoever. But you may also notice that we are visibly seeing some of these rocks drift across a lake surface as well, so that may be what our laser is hitting, is something in there. So that's the current view. And one last note, released from the USGS, there is a newly updated geologic map of the state of Hawaii been put out. 2021 version, updated. This has been posted on Hawaii Tracker, I believe. There's all kinds of online data to go together with you guys, for you guys that are really into working with these data sets as well. So we'll leave it at that. There's some other stuff in there we can dig at in the future. But we've gone on long enough today on this, so we'll just wrap it up by reviewing once again our reload, make sure we have our most current views of our webcams at the summit. So there it is from the S1 we just saw. From the B1, we still have some activity happening here on that edge and on a lower bench. And really bright at the west vent, but also some activity on the south along that crater wall, oozing up over there as well. The KW camera, it's only catching a little bit of those ooze-ups, but really that back view. And other cameras are seeing a lot of the glow in the sky. Thermal images on it consistent as well, and nice clear view from Maunaloa Strip Road tonight if anyone is looking for those star photographs. And there is a lot more on Hawaii Tracker Facebook page. You guys can see submissions from the whole community on Facebook. And besides our content that we're sharing about the volcano, it's not loading at the moment, but yeah, some elsewhere around the islands, whether it's nature or the glow or what have you there. So I'll just stop at the first picture of glow I see. Their 3D glow picture. And of course, hawaiitracker.com, where we post more relevant of our update articles, right? So when lava level went down, it came back up, see those posts around there for that whole time. And other interesting things, USGS coastal erosion mapping initiatives, geologic map, there it is, and so on and so forth. So check that out as well. And Dane, what else you got?
Yeah, that really sums up basically what we've been going over. We do have a couple questions, I believe. Let me make sure. So it was first question we'll get into was from Sharon, talking about again the caldera collapse mechanics. and the weight of the lava lake. Can the weight of the active lava lake collapse the caldera again, like in 2018?
Right now, it can't because it doesn't have the same weight as 2018. We're I would say, I haven't calculated it with the newest number, but I'd guess 8% recovered of what we lost in 2018. So we only have 8% of what we had in 2018, which is nowhere near the same amount of weight to cause any kind of collapse. That's step one. Step two, as I mentioned before, is you need to have an outlet that's lower down, right? It's not so much just the weight of it itself. It has to have a outlet lower down. And so that's where that cracking of the pool barrier that led to the 6.9 earthquake that opened the pathway further down, that's why that mattered so much, is because that allowed upper part to mobilize. So two reasons why not, right there. At least not today.
Richard asks, in a vertical magma vent, does gas rise evenly in a column with the magma or migrate towards the edges and escape it throughout the vent walls?
That's a great question. We don't know a huge amount, but there is a good amount that's been published as part of the 2018 lava lake analysis, and we do have more detail on that coming up in a future update. But what I can say is that there, when you look at the lava lake upwelling areas, you can kind of see where the spatter and bubbles occur, and how those areas move around in a lava lake. So they did that quite a bit during different eras from 2008 to 2018. And yeah, there's a couple pathways that they do come up along the walls to some degree, yes. But you gotta imagine that thing isn't straight up and down. Sometimes it can have can be flared, or it could have an upper diameter, and then lower down it can narrow and have a diameter that's narrower farther down. So you can actually come off of the edge of that inner diameter and come up in the middle of the lake and be part of the edge of the geometry as well. That's where it starts getting kind of complicated. You have to think of it in 3D as a thing, because the bubbles come up along that wall, and some may actually ride that edge outwards, and others may come straight up. So you might get two bubble paths like that, right? So all different
Right.
kinds. Yeah, it's not mixed through evenly altogether, right? The other thing that's really interesting from those studies is that whole foam layer, right? There's a whole layer of like a lava foam that's near the top where it's really, really gas rich, right? Where, lava level can rise and fall quite a bit without a whole lot of volume change. It's really just the gas moving the froth around, right? And that's the kind of thing that helps me imagine what might be happening underneath the crust of the 2021 lava lake and the 2021 that began it, right? If you have that layer of froth down there that's all bubbly, that's helping to hold everything up, not only does it help keep everything above it buoyant, that's already naturally less dense, it helps keep it more buoyant, but it also allows a pathway for all the lava that's on the surface to then dive back underneath the crust through the foam and join the stuff underneath there and just push the foam around. That seems very feasible to have that kind of lower friction zone really facilitating things in there. So
Right.
those are the my insights that I gained from those papers so far, and I'll have to present more in 2018 Lava Lake once again in the future. Yeah.
Awesome. Christy asks about the pulsing action at the western vent, and what do you think is causing that pulsing action?
I don't know. Once again, it's usually gas is what I'd refer to, right? It's just some uneven, the way that the gas can build up and flow out, right? It's not like it's pouring out of a jug through gravity and just glugging out because of that. There's actually some, like the gas builds up more pressure and it pushes out faster, then it goes a little bit slower, then it builds up faster and pushes out, which is a little bit more of, if that extreme happens, or if that happens to an extreme, you start having a gas pistoning process where the bubble occupies and disrupts the entire conduit pathway, and it might pinch the whole thing off temporarily, which is maybe what we just saw, right? So ultimately gas and some unknown movement of and adjustment of the gas and the magma system through there. Those are the variables we're dealing with for that.
Right, we'll move on to the next one. It's from Chris. He asks, what does hardly any earthquakes on the Eastern Rift Zone tell us about what's going on beneath the summit right now?
Not a whole lot, really. I mean, we know the South Flank is still having those small movements, and the South Flank is an important component of this whole equation. but what the lack of earthquakes in the East Rift Zone are telling us is that there's not enough pressure within the whole summit pathway to propagate all the way to that edge, right? So now that we've essentially burst the boil there at the center, we're now it's just oozing out rather than forcing its way out, pressurized to the point where it's quaking the East Rift and the Southwest Rift and all of that as well, right? So it's not as pressurized as before, is what we know. And yet it's still erupting, and that's because it began erupting. That makes sense.
All right. Well, apparently my screen has frozen, or my camera has. Don't know how that happened, but it did. But we're basically out of questions here. We are going to be doing a premiere of another episode of Drones On. It'll be July 22nd through July 29th. And that one, we're going to be seeing the encroachment upon the Poihi boat ramp by the lava delta, which is now 500 meters and getting closer each day, as well as a large fire that breaks out inside the Kipuka and destroys a half dozen homes or so without any firefighting activity or barely even acknowledgement that it was happening. So that'll premiere after this. Maybe give me 5 minutes. It's not that long of one. So yeah, we'll be back with you next week, and that will do it for me.
Mahalo, Dane. Mahalo to all our contributors. Thank you guys who contributed by asking questions. If you haven't already, please like, share, and subscribe. That really helps us in lots of ways. Especially if you can't contribute monetarily, that really helps out. We appreciate you guys that do donate to us as well, and all you guys interact, and of course to the Una Strong Grant and the Hawaii Community Foundation and County of Hawaii as well for supporting our work. So mahalo to everybody. We'll be back with you guys in another week, next Thursday, unless something drastic changes in the volcano, and drastic in some way where it might actually affect people or threaten people or something like that, right? If it just for a few hours turns off and on and really net no change, then we didn't feel it was enough to really break in and change our regular schedule. Just wait to catch up on it today. So there we are. That's the latest on Kilauea and a little bit of Maunaloa as well to kind of catch us up there. And until next week, you guys, mahalo for Mr. Dane DuPont, who is on the screen frozen, but smiling and shotgun you guys, and myself. Mahalo, everyone. I'm Philip Ong. Aloha.